We're here today in observance of Veterans Day. Veterans Day, of course, is not until next Friday, but we are not in school next Friday, so it doesn't make sense for us to be doing anything then, obviously. Just as a quick, before we even begin, I would just like to say thank you, of course, first and foremost, to our guest speakers today. Ms. Stoffi, who is the vice principal in charge of the social studies department. Unfortunately, she's out sick. She's not with us today, but she was a big help with this. Obviously, Mr. Hoogstreet and his TV production classes, as well as Ms. Stommel, who has sent us a photographer as well today, and our administration at large. We're lucky enough to have Mr. Ruick, our principal, on board. I believe the superintendent and some Board of Ed members are also coming today, so we're certainly thankful for the attendance of all these various groups. Just, and we'll obviously, you'll get to know these gentlemen a little bit more in a few minutes. Our guests are in the middle, Mr. Henry Luce, who served in the U.S. Navy, U.S. Army rather, as you can see, from 1968 until 1970. Mr. Ken Carson, who's right here, who served from 68 to 71, and Mr. Jacob Cavins, who you guys know from school, who, as you can see, served from 2001 until 2009. The goal for today really is to talk about war in a little bit more human terms. As a history teacher, this is something that we talk about in class. You've talked about in class before. This is something that I feel very strongly about. We have fewer and fewer veterans, quite frankly, who are alive and in our society these days. Such a huge proportion of our population served in World War II that when I was a child, there were a lot of World War II veterans around, Korean War veterans, but now there are fewer and fewer veterans around. I feel like this is a group that is, you could argue, too often overlooked. When we talk about wars in a history class, we often use phrases like we went to war or we should go to war, or if we're talking about current events, people will say things like we should or shouldn't do something. Well, for most of us, that we is not us. It's gentlemen like this and women who are serving our country and have served our country. You know, these are real people with real lives, with real families who have been really impacted by their experiences. And as people like myself and you who have not served, I don't think perhaps we quite understand what that is really like. You can read in a textbook, you can watch a Hollywood movie, but that's not the real world. You know, I think it's important to hear these stories. I think while I'd like to think I'm doing a good job in class, I think events like today could perhaps be more impactful and more memorable for you guys. So that's why we've worked hard to put this presentation together for you guys today, because we think it's something that you guys could really benefit from. So we're very thankful to have these guest speakers here today. Just so we know, we're going to try to have a little bit of chronology as we go through this today. We have some topics up here. When we kind of go through these topics, I'll ask a few questions and let these gentlemen speak to those topics. And like we said, if you guys have any questions, we strongly encourage you to ask the questions. Don't be afraid. Don't be nervous. They're all nice guys. They've all a question, you know. They volunteered to be here today. They're happy to be here. They want you guys to ask your questions. So if we just start off, if you guys don't mind, perhaps you just give us a little bit of background on yourselves, you know, who you are, where you're from, kind of how you came to be here today.
Hi, my name is Ken Carson, and I served in Vietnam, which we'll get to a little later, but I went to high school with Hank in 1964. Yeah, it's when we got out. I now currently live down in Monmouth County, have 6 grandkids, and you know, love the shore. I'm retired. I had a bunch of jobs, went from the service into corporate America, and I appreciate this opportunity to come and talk to you kids We don't get a lot of invitations to do this, and it's great. It's great to be here. So, thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And please, as Mike said, ask as many as you want. Don't be shy. And I know I've read the list that you have of discussions, and feel free if there's something else on your mind to bring it up, and we'll do our best to answer it. Thank you.
Oh, so my name is Hank Luce. I'm an old retired guy, as you can obviously tell. I did 25 years in pharmaceutical advertising as a copywriter, creative director, and creative strategist. This was after having gotten thrown out of college, which was how I ended up in Vietnam in the first place, but we'll talk about that later. I'm also the author of 4 novels, several of which have been reviewed by the Star Ledger. So if you feel like going out and purchasing 10 or 15 copies for everybody you know, please feel free to go ahead and do that. Also, in high school, we went with Mr. Shale's dad. So this is kind of an incestuous thing that we have going here. Go ahead.
Hi. Hi, I'm Jacob Cavins, or Mr. Cavins, A little bit of background on me. I grew up in Kentucky, was raised there until I was 18, got selected to go to the United States Military Academy at West Point, and from there, I graduated in high school in 1997. There was one high school for the county, just Then I graduated with an electrical engineering degree out of West Point in 2001, selected to go to flight school, and then served in various capacities in the military until 2009. Mrs. Cavins wanted me to move to New Jersey, so I said, yes, ma'am. And so moved here, fell in love with teaching, and here we are.
Yeah, and again, I know for my students, I mentioned this, for Miss Logothetis' students, both my mother and my father have known Mr. Carson and Mr. Luce since they were teenagers. When I was a kid, we saw them at family parties, at my siblings' weddings and all that. So that's the connection here as far as how these gentlemen came to come here today. So I guess we'll kind of go to topic number 2 here. If you guys don't mind, give it a little background, and then if the kids have any questions, basically about how you came to be a part of the military. Was it voluntary or not? How you went from being a civilian into being in the military.
Well, Hank and I share one thing in common. I also got thrown out of college. So, these are not 2 choir boys you're looking at here, trust me. It was early in 67. And so I enlisted. I had a choice, I guess. I could have been drafted. I didn't want to do that. So I enlisted I enlisted in the Navy with the understanding, in the medical end of the Navy, with the understanding that then I would be transferred to the Marine Corps. So my enlistment was for 4 years, 1 in the Navy, 3 in the Marine Corps, and that's how I got to where I was.
After I got thrown out of college, I started to receive hate mail from my draft board. And I figured, this is inevitable. I'm going to get carted away. So instead, I went down to enlist, because I figured, well, at least if I'm regular Army instead of a draftee, maybe I'll get treated a little differently. Of course, that was not the case at all. But I went in 1968, served first in basic training down at Fort Dix, where everybody in my basic training unit had a really interesting story. Either they were guys like me, or they just had nothing else to do in life, or they were drafted because they had jobs and they were, 19 or 20 or 21 years old, and the draft board snatched them up. So it was a very eclectic mix of people that I met all throughout the Army, and I always thought that was the most fascinating part of it.
All right, so my journey into the military started with looking at possible colleges. So, there was a few I was interested in, and then, talking with my parents, there were a couple of like reach schools. Hey, let's just try to see if you might get in. And one of those happened to be West Point. And just a little caveat how that works, you have to get a nomination from a congressman or a senator. Once you have that, now you can apply to actually try to attend. And about out of the 10,000 applicants there, they select right around 1,000. So once you're in there, it is a 4-year college, you get a degree, but now you owe time in the Army. So the initial requirement there was 5 years. I was selected for aviation, which I incurred an additional year, and then I stayed a full 8 years because the unit I was in was getting ready to be deployed, and I did not want to leave them prior to that. But my background, like my family background, grandfather was in Korean War. I have another grandfather who was in World War II. My dad was in Vietnam. A cousin was in Iraq with me. And I have a nephew and a niece that also served in the Air Force.
Does anybody have any questions regarding this part of that would relate to this? Yeah, just Sahil, yeah, just come on over. Anybody, if you have questions, guys, please don't be shy. Yeah, you can go around Sahil. If you have any questions, guys, yeah, good, Mike, thanks. Guys, just so you know, as we go through these topics, if you have a question, we know you're not being rude. You can just kind of get up and make your way over towards the podium if it's a question that relates to this part of the presentation. And again, guys, please feel free to ask. Go ahead, Mike.
This one's for you, Mr. Cavins. How did you remember your first day at West Point?
The first day at West Point is magical. So you go there, typically you go there with your parents, right? So it's your kind of your intake day, let's call it. So you go there, there's a time where you're going to go meet at a generalized location. Usually it's kind of like, a field, a football field type thing. They do a nice little discussion of how proud all the parents should be. And then they say the obligatory, take 5 minutes to, say goodbye to your child. And they're very nice. It's wonderful. Then they walk you downstairs, and they have like this little table with a piece of paper. And then you sign your name on the line. And then they start yelling at you a lot. And then they take you and they cut all your hair off as well. So the initial day is welcoming, but then they're already trying to apply as much pressure on you as possible. And there's reasons for that, right? They want you to be able to handle pressure, to be able to deal with pressure, so that when you're in the thick of things, you're able to act in your own best interest and for your soldiers that you're with.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so I have a question for Mr. Carson and Mr. Luce. So I was just wondering, what's the difference in process of enlisting in the military and being drafted, and is there different commitments that you have to that end?
Well, when I wasn't drafted, so I don't know, but I went with two friends of mine to a recruiter, and you walk in the door in the middle of a war and you tell them you want to join, and bingo, you're pretty much in. It's not very hard, but you fill out. I did all the conventional paperwork and whatnot, and as I said, I started my training really in the Navy because I had to learn. My job was to supply medical services to the combat Marines, so I then got transferred to them, so I had to go to basic like everybody else, and then some different schools, and then I got transferred to the Marines and got into jungle warfare school and everything. But it was very much the same way, and I think for all of us, you signed on a line. You in my case, I got on a plane and then on a bus. I wound up in the Great Lakes, and I had come up from Florida, and I had on, I remember, sandals and no socks, and maybe a member's jacket, because that was cool in 1968, And it was about 14 below zero, or felt like it. And they started yelling at us right away and continued right through all my training.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
And the thing about at least basic training, and as Ken said, we went through a whole lot of different kinds of training, and I'll tell you, some about that. But in basic training, you are totally, suddenly divorced from whatever your life was before that. And the whole world is olive green at that point. You're getting yelled at, you're getting threatened by things. They used to say in basic training, if you guys screw up, we're going to send you to Fort Polk for infantry. And I thought, listen, I don't know if that applies to me. I'm probably going to be a clerk typist or a chaplain's assistant or something like that. And when basic training was over and they handed me my orders, the guy said, Luce, you are out of luck, Fort Polk. And that was for advanced infantry training.
Thank you.
Just like kind of a quick follow-up, I know this is something that we kind of touch on in class. In Vietnam, something that's talked about, although it wasn't as common as perhaps the media would make it look. Did you ever have any vague thought of saying, I just can't do this, I don't want to serve, I don't want to be drafted, the proverbial I'm going to Canada thing, something along those lines?
No, never did.
Never occurred to me to do that.
All right, thank you. So at this point, I guess if we move on to number 3, and again, guys, if you have questions here, you can start working your way over, and please ask. So now you've all enlisted, or let's say you've graduated from West Point, you're in the regular Army. Prior to the actual, being in theater, what could you say about the training, the preparation, your own feelings, trepidation perhaps, as you were training to go off and actually be fighting?
Well, as Hank had mentioned, in my case, there was a lot of different types of training that I had to do. So I would just go from one school to another. And, basically in school, in the military, it's a little different. You're tied up 24/7. It's not like here, but, you learn one skill and then another until they want you ready. The one thing I remember clearly about my training was I've now transferred into the Marine Corps, and I was out in Camp Pendleton, and we were taught, and all our instructors, I was in jungle warfare school and a few other things out there, and all our instructors were recent Vietnam returnees. They were usually sergeants or corporals who had just come home, so they could give us like the latest information about what it was really like. And I was sitting in a room, and this guy was talking about shooting, the marksmanship, and he had a dummy up behind him, and he's going, now when you take a shot, you want to go here, here, and here, and he was pointing at the dummy's heart, because they're good kill shots, and you're probably not going to get one in the head. So just be sure that that's where you shot. And he said it, in my view, very matter-of-factly, And then, it hit me, and I thought, I'm going to go to a very dangerous place. This isn't going to be fun anymore. So that was my training story.
After basic training, I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana for advanced infantry training. And we were arriving on the fort on a bus. And there's a big sign over the gate. And the sign says, "Welcome to Fort Polk, home of the combat infantrymen for Vietnam." And that's when it really sank in. And then we went to the part of the fort, again, a big banner. It says, "Welcome to Tigerland." And the idea was you're supposed to be rough like a tiger. And everywhere we went, we were running here, running there to training, supposed to growl like a tiger. Well, after about a day and a half of this, I had no voice left from growling. So I would go, like this. And every time a drill sergeant went by, would say, because I wasn't growling, I was knocking out push-ups. Drop and give me 20. And I have to do 20 push-ups. I got to be in great shape from all those push-ups, but my throat was not particularly good. But one day in Fort Polk, an odd thing happened. There were a bunch of us that were called out into the company area from different platoons. And I think it was about 10 of us. And the company first sergeant was out there, and he wasn't sure what was going on, and he was reading that there was a new school being started in Fort Benning, Georgia, and it was non-commissioned officers candidate school. You go for 15 weeks and you get to be a sergeant. The reason they were doing this was because so many sergeants were getting killed in Vietnam. And this was the school, was the first of its kind, excuse me, because it wasn't the normal military operations specialty of 11 Bravo, light weapons infantry. This was 11 Foxtrot, infantry operations and intelligence, reconnaissance. Now, I know that infantry intelligence sounds like an oxymoron. Believe me, it really is. But it was the intelligence and reconnaissance part that was fascinating. And that's how I ended up in Fort Benning.
So for me, I had the college or kind of quasi-college experience. So I was able to go to classes, get a degree, but it wasn't, your traditional experience, So there was curfews. You were not allowed to have, opposite gender people in your room. So there was a lot of kind of rules that went along with that. Through the 4 years, during the summers, you had opportunities for particular training. I was able to do air assault school. I was able to go to a fort and program some through Java, like a forearm like map system. So I was able to get a lot of exposure for those things, right? And then finally get selected to go to aviation, and then once you're in Fort Rucker, Alabama, going through flight school, it was actually a little fun. It was a little loose. You had a little bit more freedom. Some of your classmates were there, and it was a good time. You were commissioned as an officer at that point, so there was, so you had the rank, so it was kind of nice. And but academically, it was challenging. You could almost equate it to like a master's in aviation. I was able to get a commercial rotor wing pilot's license out of it. But yeah, that's how it started.
All right, if you guys would like to ask some questions, Kara, come on up.
I was wondering did you feel ready to fight and go to war based off of the training that you received?
I felt as ready as I was going to be because I didn't know what I was walking into. I frankly had no idea. I got there and found out that a lot of stuff I learned wasn't right, and it was the people in country that frankly saved my life and fixed me up with what I needed to know.
There's an interesting distinction here, and that is, you asked, do we feel ready? Yes, we did. We did feel ready and well-trained and qualified, but there was utterly no desire to do that. And if I could have stayed away from all of that, that would have been just fine. But things just happened. I reported to my first duty station in Vietnam. I was with the 82nd Airborne Division at a place called Firebase All-America 2. Firebase is like a big parking lot with sandbag bunkers, few tents, and maybe an artillery piece in the middle of it, maybe 100 guys. And I just arrived there, and I was reporting into the company commander, who was down what they call the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center. I was reporting in, saying, Sergeant Luce reports all that. Guy comes running in the door, and he says to the company commander, is there anybody here who knows how to use a Mighty Mite? And the company commander said, well, geez, I don't know. And I said, oh, sir, I was trained on a Mighty Mite back in the States. A Mighty Mite, when you see guys with leaf blowers, they have the leaf blower on their back and they're blowing the stuff. Mighty Mite, this is like 50 years ago, Mighty Mite was an aluminum frame with a little motor on the back and a hose. And the idea was that if you found tunnels, you dropped a smoke grenade or a tear gas grenade into the mouth of the tunnel, blew the smoke through the tunnel, and then watched where it came up. The idea would be to chase out anybody who's hiding in the tunnel. So like a stooge, I said, oh, I know how to do that. They immediately put me on a helicopter, gave me a Mighty Mite, and sent me out to the field. And after I blew the smoke through the tunnel and they shot a couple of guys, a lieutenant comes over and he says, "Nice work, Sarge, nice work." He pulls out a .45 and a flashlight, and he says to me, "Okay, now go see if there's anybody else in there." And that's how I became a tunnel rat for a couple of months, which was not fun.
As far as being prepared, I think coming out of flight school, you are technically prepared, right? So you can operate the aircraft, you know how all that's going to go. You've had your leadership courses, but once you're in your unit, I was in the position where I'm 22 years old, and I am now in charge of 40-year-olds, like these warrant officers. So quickly you had to recognize that being a good leader at that point was listening to your people and using their experience to move forward. And I think that there's going to be a little bit of naivety kind of going into things. And for me, the third day in country, I have an RPG explode right next to my helicopter. And at that point, I was like, and so there was a mental shift at that point. Because things aren't really real until you're put in a situation where now you feel your life or the life of your friend or soldier is in danger. So that was a moment where, okay, this is not a game, this is serious, and then you push forward from there.
Thank you. My question is, are movie scenes from boot camps accurate? How do you feel about the movie scenes, and what's military training actually like, and do you think movies and shows should fix the way they depict it?
Again, I think that's kind of an individual question, so I'll just tell you in my case. I tend not to watch any boot camp war movies, particularly around the time of Vietnam. Just because there's one of the things that I came home with was a disease actually called PTSD, and the movies and stuff sometimes trigger that off. So I don't watch any of that. So I really can't talk about how real they are or not real. But I've never really seen anything that is as real as actual combat, and I hope I never do again. I hope none of you ever do.
Thank you.
In terms of movies and stories about the war, I used to see some of the movies, but it was funny because I never invested myself in the movie. I never took it as an example of, gee, sure, I know what this is like, or this is fake, or something. It was always a distance about that, and I didn't identify with the characters. I didn't want to get emotionally involved with them because I didn't want to trigger, as Ken was alluding to, any kind of memories or bad feelings. So there was always this distance, both intellectual and emotional distance.
Thanks.
The same.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering how you guys were treated and your living space and hours of work in the military.
I guess kind of like living conditions and so forth as you were being prepared.
Well, I mean, I would say, at being prepared, as we're going through schools, we lived in barracks and always had a mess hall to go eat, etc. Going overseas, I spent the majority of my time in what's, in the common vernacular, it's called the bush, which is the jungles of Vietnam. I was with the 3rd Marines. We operated from a place called Quang Tri up into the DMZ and kind of west over to Laos. So 99% of my time was outdoors with these various, we would go on patrols and the ambushes, etc. So we really didn't have mess halls or anything else. There was none of that. And we would come into the fire bases that Hank talked about before, and just for resupply for a day or two. And, that's the way we lived out there. It just was. If it rained, it rained. I spent 3 days in a foxhole once during a typhoon, which I never thought I would do, but where the water just filled up. But that's the way it was. There was no way to get out. Then when I came back to the States, to Camp Pendleton, it was fine. The same thing. I mean, there were barracks, and at that point, I was getting ready to get married, and I eventually lived off base, and then it was great.
Pretty much the same living conditions that Ken was describing. And one fire base, it was, they had sent home the 82nd Airborne Division. I did not have enough time in country to go home with the division, so I was transferred to the 1st Infantry Division. And we were in the western part of the country at a place called Fire Base Normandy 3. And I was living with a couple of guys in a bunker, a sandbag bunker, and a couple of cots on the thing. And in the middle of the fire base was a big 155 millimeter howitzer that would begin to, fire at different targets. And I sometimes at night, when we weren't patrolling, would try to read by candlelight. And this thing was so powerful that if it fired over our little bunker, would lift me off the cot and blow out the candle. That's how the concussion was. So reading was very difficult over there.
And for myself, I had the luxury of being in an aviation unit, right? So along with the helicopter is, all the maintenance associated with that. So there were often times that we were in kind of a more well-protected area because we had to have like a little runway and whatnot. But we would often be sent out to other places, and we're a helicopter, so we can land anywhere. So there'd be 3-day stints, week stints, where we're kind of just sleeping underneath the helicopter, whatever it happens to be. We absolutely loved if we had to go to an Air Force base because they had the best food. It was great. It was wonderful there. And I spent about 3 years total in Iraq, and you could see, especially with Halliburton, they started really kind of ramping up the lodging, the food, and it did get better over time.
Thank you. Hi. So my main question was, you talked a lot about what your training was like and what you really were taught. But compared to your experiences in the real world and in war, what are some things that you feel weren't taught in training, and maybe some things that really can't be taught?
Well, in the war, as I said, when I got there, I had a lot of ideas about how to survive, and quickly learned that they were not accurate. I remember clearly I got into Vietnam one day and was choppered and moved around for about a day worth of that stuff. And then they dropped me where my unit was, which happened to be in the jungle in the DMZ at the time. And I had a backpack and all the stuff that, they sent us out with. And my sergeant came over and just looked at it and immediately took like half of the stuff and threw it away. And he said, okay, now here's what you need. And, without somebody who's been there and had been through it and in the thick of it, I don't think I could have ever made it out. So that was very, very handy. Coming home, when I was out of Vietnam and then later out of the service, I think the thing that happened to me, and we're not suggesting you guys get thrown out of school, believe me, but my father put it best to me. He said, I think you've finally grown up, and so that was a big difference for me. And I had the GI Bill, went back to school, etc., got married, have a bunch of kids, etc. So it kind of gave me the base to go forward.
I think there's an interesting distinction about the technical training and the psychological. training or lack thereof. Technical training was really, I'm not the most mechanical guy in the world, but if I could field strip an M16 blindfolded in 30 seconds, the training is really pretty good. But the way to handle the situations you're in, emotionally and intellectually, is really very difficult, because you're going to lose guys that you know. It may not be your best buddy, but you're going to lose guys that you know. You're going to see really ugly, awful kinds of things. And you may even have to take part in some of that. The way to deal with that, although there are some classes and lectures and things that you get, the way to deal with that, I think, really depends on an individual and an individual's background and life experiences to deal with that. I mean, the Army can help only so much, but it's really up to the individual to cope with it. And that's why a lot of guys, have certain experiences that they don't get over, or they don't want to ever relive.
Could you repeat the question, please? I'm so sorry.
Of course, yeah. So through your training, they teach a lot of the technical aspects and the basic fundamentals of war, but once you were really put out into the real world, what are some things that you believe weren't taught to you in your training, or things that you believe just cannot be taught?
Okay, and I think you're going to see this if you decide to go in the military, stay in civilian life, you're going to get through high school, you're going to through college, you're going to have all these classes, and then you're going to get a job. And then when you get this job, it's a whole new things that you have to learn on the job training. And oftentimes it's trying to drink from a fire hose. It's it's coming at you. For me, the biggest thing that I had to learn was to, listen, to my people, right? Listen to my people. And, there comes a point where everything that you've learned really doesn't matter if you can't get your people home, right? So you'll do whatever it takes, regardless of what the manual says, to get your people home.
Thank you so much.
Before we get on to kind of point 4 here, life while fighting, you guys spoke very eloquently about your training before you went off to do the actual fighting. Could you speak a little bit about, I guess, the more emotional side? I mean, my thoughts were you scared? Were you terrified? Was there, as you were on that plane or on that transport where you knew now we're actually going, what was your emotional state like as you knew, holy cow, now I'm really going to do this?
My emotional state, well, first of all, I didn't really clearly understand what I was walking into. I think it's impossible. You heard Hank relay some of that stuff that we've all been through. But from the day I finished my training until I came home, my entire focus was staying alive and keeping the people that depended on me when I was doing my job alive as long as I could, to get them, if they'd been wounded, and well, they always were, and get them on a chopper and get them out to a hospital. So it was my focus was very simple. It was just don't get killed and keep those around you the same.
I think that's exactly right. The notion, the overpowering feeling that you have is not to let your buddies down. After a while, you really don't care about the morality of the war. You care about your own morality, certainly, but you don't care what's going on, back in the States, what they're doing on television, how people think about it. It's the people immediately around you. You don't want to let your buddies down, and you'll do practically anything not to let them down.
Absolutely, couldn't have said it better. It's, you go in you're basically a kid. You go in there and, not to tell too much, but one of my classmates from West Point I deployed with, we were in Kuwait just doing the training, and there was a catastrophic accident where, the person that I hung out with for 4 years is no longer, and so you do everything in your power to prevent that from happening.
Just one final question. Mr. Luce and Mr. Carson, you guys obviously enlisted during Vietnam. Mr. Cavins, can you just quickly give us a timeline of, I guess, when you entered West Point and when 9/11 happened and how that perhaps changed everything?
Oh, absolutely. I remember this vividly. So I did graduate West Point in 2001, right? And then was in flight school. And so I remember sometime right around September, I was let off for lunch. So I went and got Wendy's, go to my little apartment, I turn on the TV, and on the TV is the 9/11, right? It's the planes hitting. And right then, it's just a sinking feeling because you know what is coming next. So that was kind of what I realized I was now going to war.
Thank you. All right, so now we're kind of getting up to the point 4 on the screen behind me. As far as you guys spoke about your training, now you're in Vietnam, you're overseas, you're in Iraq. Could you give us a little background on what your specific job, what your role was, and perhaps what a day or a week in the life was like you? You know, we watch movies and we kind of just see soldiers. We perhaps don't really know the different roles, like what you guys did and what life was like for you on a daily or weekly basis.
Well, I was assigned to the Marine Corps Infantry. I was part of the Marines, and our job was really pretty simple. We spent all our time going out into the jungle, and we would look for the North Vietnamese, if we found them, then we would fight with them. And if they found us, then they would fight with us. We went out for sometimes a week, sometimes a month. It really didn't matter, and we were out just in the middle of nowhere. Is the only way I can describe it. It was quite an experience. We also set up ambushes at night. They set up ambushes at night, and again, when we crossed each other, we fought each other, and people got killed because it was a war. My job specifically was any of the Marines that I was with that got wounded, I would do what I could first aid-wise to keep them alive, lay them out, and then, like Mr. Caven, people like him flew in helicopters, and we put the wounded on helicopters, and then they would take them back to the rear, to the hospitals and everything, and then we would get new people. I told Mr. Shale before that more than once these chopper pilots saved my life from getting out of bad situations.
For most of my tour, after I stopped being a tunnel rat, which a guy Ken's size would never be a tunnel rat, but a guy my size, they look exactly at. After I did that, I became what was called a LRP, and that means Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol. And they would helicopter a squad, 6 guys, climb in a helicopter, no doors on the chopper, and you'd be hanging. And since I was the sergeant and the squad leader, I was the last guy in and the first guy out, so that meant I was hanging with my legs out the door like this, holding on to something. And they would drop us into what were called free fire zones. That means if it moves out there, it's a bad guy. And what we were supposed to do, we'll look for large concentrations of the enemy and then either call in artillery strikes on them or to call up the helicopter, what was called at the time a pink team. And a pink team was a small light observation helicopter that would try to locate where you were based on the coordinates you gave them. And high above, circling, would be an Apache gunship. And then you would crawl in the gunship if you located, concentration of the enemy. And the gunship would come down and take out the enemy. And of course, that would give away the fact that there was alert patrol in there. So then we had to get the hell out of there and then go to the next place that we were assigned.
For myself, so I flew Apache helicopters, which is a 2-person aircraft. They sit in tandem. Both seats can fly. Primarily the person in the back flies. But the seat in the front has all the long-range like optics and can use all the weapon systems. So there's a 30 millimeter, which you hold about 1,200 rounds of those. You have 2.75 Hydra rockets, and you also have Hellfire missiles. We do not transport any person, so our only job was to go where the trouble was. So there was basically like 3 main types of operations. There was like a patrol, where basically you have a window of time there, you're up in the air, you're flying around, you're monitoring the radios. There's escort missions, dignitaries or whatever else that needs, they're in the Blackhawks, the Chinooks, so you're flying with them. And the other is, the last one is when you're doing like purposeful, like deliberate operations. So oftentimes I would work with Navy SEALs and other things like that. So my duties in flying, really, I was kind of like the command and control. So I'm planning the mission. The way the helicopter is set up, I have multiple, like 3 different screens I have to manage. There's 4 radios you have to manage. Plus I have the long-range sights. So basically, without giving out classified numbers, I could see you 3 miles away, and if I knew who you were, I can tell who you are. I can certainly tell if you're a guy or a girl. So those are the types of kind of operations we went through. Over the course of my time in Iraq, if they figure out you're decent at something, they just give you more work to do. So towards the end, I was actually planning all of the major aviation operations at the north half of Iraq. Prior to that, I was doing a lot of operations in and around Baghdad.
All right, if you guys have any questions.
Okay, so I know you guys already talked about this a lot, especially in the other topics, but basically while serving in your respective conflicts, did you get to witness firsthand any brand new American military like innovations or technologies? And if so, how did these help or hurt yourself or your country's own cause?
I didn't see anything new. We had the I don't want to say the usual stuff for war, but we did. We had, but I don't think anything. There was no super technology that was available. It was everything that you guys could imagine. It was obviously guns. It was the recoilless rifles that Hank mentioned. Lots of mortars. Lots of things that blew up and killed people. But it wasn't. It really wasn't new. They did have napalm that they would drop in airstrikes to clear out parts of the jungle so we could see better going through them. And of course, you've all heard the term Agent Orange. They were dropping Agent Orange all over the place. We thought it was a good thing because it was going to, it was a pesticide going to, again, kill the foliage so you could see better. And now we know that it was actually harmful to everybody, including us.
It seems funny to think of a pesticide as technology, but Ken's exactly right. There were huge concentrations of Agent Orange all throughout the country. And if you look at a map of Vietnam, which is kind of like shaped like the state of California, but flipped to the other side, it was divided into 4 regions called Corps, C-O-R-P-S. Up north was I Corps, around the demilitarized zone. 2 Corps was the Central Highlands. 3 Corps was the area from Saigon west to the Cambodian border. And 4 Corps was the Mekong River Delta, rice paddies and all of that. I once looked at a map of the highest concentrations of Agent Orange, and it was 3 Corps, where I spent most of my time, and I Corps, where I spent the last 2 months of my tour. And so it's always been on my mind that such a low-tech thing like a pesticide could do so much damage. It still amazes me about that.
And just real quick, because I know some of you guys, you have not gotten to the point at Wayne Hills where we've talked about Vietnam. Some of you seniors have, some of the juniors and the sophomores have not. Again, Vietnam being very thick jungles, Agent Orange, a pesticide that would kill the leaves, make the jungles less dense, easier to find your enemy. We have since found out it was a major cancer-causing agent, and there are scores of Vietnam veterans who have and are still paying the price with the after effects of that even today.
For myself, just the nature of my job, there was a lot of technology involved. I can say that my first deployment into Iraq really kind of started seeing the UAVs show up. So those were prominent, and one of the things I had the opportunity to do, because the decision-making and implementation cycle, like the OODA loops, of the insurgency was much smaller than a larger force like the military trying to adapt, right? So it was always like a cat and mouse game of they would come up with a system, we would have to defeat it. They come up with a different system that we'd always have to be reacting to. But one of the things that I had the opportunity to do was to leverage Army aviation assets, the UAVs, and also the Air Force, which hadn't been done at that time in the theater, to really target specific corridors that were having a lot of IEDs that were impacting the soldiers on the ground. So we were able to reduce that by about 40% just by coordinating the different technologies of the different branches.
Thank you.
Oh, there you go.
So, as you guys have explained to us, each of you served in specialized and relatively dangerous positions. So, my question was there a mental process or any tactics that you used to focus yourself or calm yourself down before going off onto a mission or an operation?
No, there was no specific exercises or anything. As I said, we were out all the time. So for the year, we were there. The focus was stay alive and keep those around you alive.
I would try to find some kind of inner stillness to calm myself down and prepare myself for whatever was going to come ahead. And that might be simply looking at clouds in the sky, or the direction of the breeze, or the sound of the rain. Some kind of a thing that would promote this kind of inner stillness, and then help me concentrate and focus on what the mission was, what my responsibility was to the mission, and most importantly, to the guys around me.
Definitely that, absolutely. Another thing that evolved over time was, humans that are in combat, right? It's not like a natural thing to be in, so there's a lot of stress involved and all that. And you do look for outlets. And one of the outlets is a very dark sense of humor sometimes. It's a way to kind of like deal with everything that's going on in the moment. It kind of builds up camaraderie. So basically making connections with, the people you're with can kind of like strengthen your resolve as you're going to go out, outside the wire.
Thank you.
Hi. So how was communication with your family or friends during your time of service?
Well, it was limited in a word. It was not like today. There was no internet, and there was a mail service, which took, we were talking about it before, maybe 3 weeks, for you to get a letter, and the same thing, when we sent it back. There were no phones or anything, where we were. So that was it. It was for me. It was all mail that you picked up in the fire base when you happened to come in, and it did take just 2 or 3 weeks each way to get a letter sent to you.
I did have the opportunity to talk to my parents on one occasion when I was in R&R, which means rest and recuperation. And you can go, you get 5 days, and they'll fly you to all kinds of different places. And I happened to choose Sydney, Australia. So they flew me from Vietnam, and with a bunch of guys that are going there too, to Sydney, Australia, where I was able to make a phone call, back home to my parents. And I think there's and you would probably know, I think it's about a 13-hour time difference between, New Jersey and Sydney. So I forget what time of the night it was, but my parents were up, and it was great to talk to them. It was also powerfully emotional, and I almost felt more pain after having spoken to them than prior to doing that, because it conjured up all kinds of memories and things and how much we loved each other. It was really tough communication, that one.
Right, because you have to compartmentalize a lot of yourself when you're in war. So having to or getting the opportunity to talk to a loved one kind of opens some of that up, right? And you're really trying to guard off on all that. For me, it was initially very difficult. I think my first deployment, I was able to make 4 phone calls home, which was nice. My second deployment got a little bit better. There was the option, there was a place you could go and send an email, but it took you had to sign up, and it was like a week in advance to be able to get that. Now, there was a lot of internet, but it wasn't like your traditional internet. So there was a nipper and a sipper, right? So there's a secret internet that's actually like a closed off from the actual internet. So we had access to that, but there was no way to communicate from there, to home. So communication is limited, and like he said, it was often kind of difficult to have those conversations because a lot of the experiences that you're having, you don't want to worry anybody at home. So you're not really telling them everything that's happening and going on.
Thank you.
My question was based on the war as a whole. So, was there a specific moment that made your time in the Army worth all of its struggles?
Say a little louder.
Was there a specific moment that made your time in the Army worth all of its struggles?
Is there something that you made it feel like it was worth it?
Yes, we're kidding. I mean, is it worth all the struggles? No. I mean, I would not care for you or anybody I know to have to go through some of the experiences that I went through. It's not. Some of it was terrible. There were some benefits to it for sure. I think I mentioned earlier my father's comment where you finally grew up. The GI Bill helped me go back, get out of college. It actually helped me with some expenses when we bought our first house and had our first baby, etc. So those were all good things. I'm certainly not ashamed of it. I'm proud of it. I learned an awful lot about life going through the service. But would I want to do it again? No, thanks. I don't think so.
My feelings are very similar to Ken's, and the idea worth it. Two ways to look at that. One is, was it worth it from a political point of view? And was the war worth it? Was my experience contributing to that war? Was that worth it, on some kind of political level? And I think not. In terms of my own sense of the world, in terms of my own sense of myself, and what you might call, my growth and gaining some kind of wisdom about myself and about the world, boy, it's pretty close. I'm glad that that I benefited from that, but asking was it worth it, like Ken says, I certainly wouldn't do it again. And I talked both of my sons, out, if you want to make a contribution, to the country, then become a first responder, but, save the military for disaster, for something that you absolutely necessary.
And for myself, I would say that you get an opportunity to see both the worst and the best in people. So I feel lucky that I was able to serve with some very outstanding people, and I'll cherish those memories. But like was said before, I would not wish on any of you any of the things that maybe we have had to do or that we've had to see or experience.
Thank you.
Outside of being in battle, what was life like while serving, like being in like the camps or like the army bases or like being stationed in our nearest cities?
What was it like? You mean just not counting combat?
Yeah, just like life outside of like the actual fighting.
Well, a lot of it was school before, and after, for me, when I got sent to Camp Pendleton, I think I mentioned, and it was just like, it was almost like a regular job. I had a squad of people who worked for me, and we did pretty much maintenance around the base. We had been trained. We did minimum PT and everything because the school regiment wasn't required, and there was no drills, ambush, any of that stuff. That all went away. So that wasn't bad. I actually at night when I got home. Got my real estate license in California because I just wanted to make some extra money, and I sold real estate on weekends, when I was in there. So it's pretty much a 9-to-5 job. It wasn't terrible. And in my last year of my enlistment, I was married and lived off base anyhow, so it was like 9-to-5 type thing.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Outside of like actually fighting, what was life while you're in service?
Almost downtime. Have downtime.
Not a lot of downtime, but as was mentioned previously, during the downtime, mostly I tried to read. I was always having people send me books, and in my backpack, along with water and ammunition and a change of socks, and some underwear, I was always carrying a couple of books in order to, not only stay literate, but kind of transport myself out of, where I was. But another part was meeting and talking to and sharing experiences with a whole bunch of interesting guys, with a lot of interesting people from all different parts of the country, different life experiences, educational backgrounds, ethnicities, religions. I always found that really, really fascinating. So when the downtime occurred, hanging out with these guys was most enjoyable.
Yeah, same. The downtime, it's hanging out with people of caliber is always going to be, amazing. I was always fortunate, I felt that I was always around people that were better than me. So I always felt like I was learning, from them, which was nice. But a lot of the downtime, in aviation is training. It's highly technical. There's a lot of requirements to be current on certain things. So, it's exploring tactics. It's actually, doing training flights. It's doing all the maintenance. So it is, there's a lot of work there, but it is enjoyable. And, you build those friendships and those camaraderies, and, everybody likes to use the term, family, but it really is. It really is kind of like a family.
Thank you.
So, war seems like a very stressful experience. So what really kept you motivated while you were fighting and deployed during service?
First of all, you're correct. It is a stressful experience. Again, we've said it before, just my motivation was just staying alive. trying not to get killed, trying to keep my platoon of people that were with me alive as well, so we get through this thing and get home.
And I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's the motivation has nothing to do with politics, or who's in Washington, D.C., giving orders or any of that stuff. As we've said before, it's first responsibility is certainly to the mission, but then to the people that you find yourself with. So I don't think that anything, it seems you're so focused and your world is so small that all of those other things that are going on in the world really don't matter, because your world may be however many square miles you have to cover, or the size of your fire base. That's the world shrinks down to that. So larger things and other things that are going on in the world, don't matter.
Yeah, I would say, as my time as an officer there, my only concern was getting my people home. And part of that, right, is, since I'm flying an attack helicopter too, is I also have a responsibility for those soldiers that are not in my unit that I'm responding to. And we did everything that we were supposed to do and could do to help ensure that they also got to go home to their families.
Thank you.
Hi. So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for your service. And as everyone probably knows, it's a very stressful and high-pressure job. So my question is, how do you manage the stress and pressure of fighting and being in the military?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much what we said before. When you're in the middle of the stress, you're just stressing, so you can't really manage it. But before and after, you try to relax best you can. Figure out the things that you can do, that would help. And in my case, I just surrounded myself with the people I was with 24/7. And we just talked to each other and just relaxed with each other best we could under the circumstances.
Well, would it be correct to say that the various men you serve with, it perhaps ran the gamut between people who could handle these things better and some just couldn't handle them as well and cope?
I think that's true, and I think you find out in training who you can count on, the kind of person you can count on and rely on, and who you want to keep some distance from. And when you get incompetent, when you get overseas, you don't have as much freedom to avoid someone that you don't have tremendous confidence in, but you really are alert to the fact that, okay, when it really starts to hit the fan now, I don't think this guy is going to come through. And what can I do, or what can we do, to avoid any terrible consequences of that?
Yeah, and then, there's some coping mechanisms that I think are universal. For me, I had to try to work out while I was there. I had to work out so hard that I was completely exhausted. Sometimes you throw up. But it's the only way to kind of get all of that stress out. Also, just in my position, I was always looking for ways to maybe kind of mitigate the stress of my soldiers. So the rare occurrence I get a day off, I'm going to one of my guys, I'm like, okay, you're off guard tower duty. You're taking the day off, so I'll take that duty for him, because that helped ease my mind for him, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
My question is, would you guys be able to tell us about your most toughest to complete or your most challenging mission and what it was like during combat?
I'll say this. There's several specific things that come to mind, and I would ask your indulgence. I'm not going to review the details of them because I really don't think they're that relevant. War as a as an institution is nasty and dirty, and people live and they die. We were fortunate enough to get through it, the three of us. So I don't even know if I can remember just one particular, but I'll, kind of pass on that question if you don't mind. Thanks.
Sorry. Thank you.
I think for me it was the tunnel. It was doing the tunnel work, and tunnels could be anywhere from 20 yards long to 100 and have multiple different levels.
I just threw that up just for a little reference.
Oh, for heaven's sake!
Just a general reference.
Those guys look like they're living pretty well back there. I don't know. It wasn't any of the tunnels I saw, but they could be multi-level. They could have things stored in them. So if you came across something in a tunnel, not just like another guy, but if you came across, say, some weapons, or you came across ammunition, that stuff could be booby-trapped. So it wasn't just the closeness and the crawling around through there. It was what you might find and then what might happen as a consequence of that. And the stress of that was really pretty powerful. So as I said, I did that for a couple of months until it finally dawned on me that instead of, being helicoptered into all these different places where people were finding tunnels, why didn't I just request some more Mighty Mites and train the guys in the line companies how to do it so they wouldn't have to get me out there, which is eventually what I did.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pass on those.
All right. Thank you all for your service.
So all of you talked about some motivations that you had to keep fighting during the war, but were there any times when you just didn't want to fight anymore?
There were like everyday times that I wanted to go home from the war. You really don't, you really don't have a choice. You're out in God knows where, and you're on these missions, and you run into people, or they run into you, and you battle or do what you need to do. So there were plenty of times where I was like exhausted and tired and beat up physically and everything, but I used to think a lot about, wow, how many more days before I can get out of here and go home. But I never really thought about like, well, this isn't fun. I don't want to play anymore. Coach, take me out, put me on the bench for a while. So, that part of it, no. But clearly, I was very, very happy the day I got pulled out and put on a plane and sent over to Okinawa and then home.
Again, Ken's exactly right. You really don't have much of a choice, but in order to cope with it, there are a variety of things you can do, whether it's work out like crazy or I used to like to keep what was called a short timers calendar. And you would mark off each day getting you closer to going home. And if you get under 100 days, you are known as a two-digit midget, the day that you got to 99 days to go home. And that was a cause for like a little celebration to do that. Then when you began to get really close to going home, down into a couple of weeks, Then you start to get nervous because you think, please, dear God, don't let anything happen to me this close to going home. And when you finally get down to a matter of days when you're really short, when you're a really short timer, you spend most of the time terrified. By that time, then it's a couple of days, you're usually back in a rear area, and they're getting ready to process you out so you can go home.
Yeah, funny, kind of funny little story. So my second deployment, so I had two major deployments where I went over with units, had kind of a other thing, it was a civilian clothes piece over there, but the second deployment, it was supposed to be a 12-month deployment. So towards the end of the 11th month, I got the notice that, oh, it's now going to be an 18-month deployment. So that was very exciting, but.
Thank you very much for your time and for your service.
Hi, this is more towards Mr. Carson. We watched Letters from Vietnam and history, so I was just wondering how it felt like being videotaped, if you felt that it was invasive.
No, I mean, first of all, the background is that we talked about these fire bases, and I happened to was on patrol and came in to restock ammo and whatnot, which is very common. And our lieutenant told us to shave, and that was very unusual. Why would you shave to go out and shoot at people? But we did, and there were some reporters there, and it was during the time that Nixon had announced that they were starting to pull out troops, and they wanted reactions from the troops. So they took this very quick newsreel of us, and then, you know, I went back out, and there was no way to tell my parents or anything. And, you know, they played it on the news. Fortunately, my parents got to see it, and NBC News sent to my parents the footage and everything. It was nice of them to do that. And then years later, I was working for Time Warner, who owned HBO, who made that movie. And it's a combination of letters, real letters written by real people that were overseas, but read by actors, the real footage of, you know, what we went through, and then some commentary done by professionals. And for some reason, I have no idea why, my group, my squad, and my picture wound up on there. And the first time I saw it, I was in the city, and the guys from HBO called me and said, "Do you know you're in this thing called Letters from Home?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And that's when I got to see it. So I really wasn't, you know, I mean, I didn't feel it was invasive. It was part of history. If you see the whole thing, you know, there's not even one word that I said that they kept in the thing. It's just my picture in a millisecond that kind of goes through there, and that's what it is. So it didn't bother me. But thanks for asking.
Just real quickly, for a little bit of context, what Lily and Mr. Carson were referring to is a documentary that I've shown for years in my class. Being that Vietnam was the first, as they called it, living room war, there was so much newsreel footage. When I was a middle schooler, having seen Mr. Carson my whole childhood because he was friends with my folks, I saw this clip, and I don't know how readily, I don't use this interface here. There he is, right up. Well, can I go back a little with this, Jacob, with my finger? Is that how this works? Should. Let me see if I can go back just a little bit. There he is right there. Good-looking guy. So again, as a middle schooler, when I saw this, I was homesick, supposedly. I called my mother, and I'm like, I think I see him on TV. I didn't know. I was a middle schooler. I didn't know he had served, etc. So I've been showing this to my classes for years. So as Lily mentioned, it was really great to have Mr. Carson come and speak, kind of put a face to a person, to the actual man on the screen.
Lily,
Thanks.
I would just say this: if this helps anybody here or any place, you know, get a better sense of some of the sacrifices that people made during that time, then to me it's worth it. Personally, I was not offended.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. So for the Vietnam veterans, we learned a lot about how, especially fighting on like home turf for the Vietnamese and for like the Viet Cong, how they were like really brainwashed against us, and how like they were taught that like anything was better than defeat. So I was just wondering if you had any like non-hostile interactions with any like North Vietnamese or like people there who you were supposed to be like fighting against, and if like that gave you any insight into the war.
Well, the people that I encountered, that we fought against, very much felt that way, and that's very true what you said. It was their home, their families, and from their perspective, they were ready to do whatever they had to do, particularly die if that was required, to keep what they thought was the big evil, from taking over their country. We, of course, had a different perspective, but it didn't matter to them. And that was the situation. They were really vested. God forbid, I hope it never happens, that we here in our country have to fight a war on our turf, because it would be the same thing, I would think, going the other way. Look at the you watch the news, and look at what's going on now. It's unbelievable, and those guys will do anything to keep the Russians out, and I think that's common for the country defending itself.
Thank you.
I remember, and I don't know if you guys remember the great boxer Muhammad Ali. When Ali was going to be drafted, he refused to go, and he didn't go, and they asked him why, and Ali said, "I ain't got nothing against them Viet Congs." Well, I have to say that I could understand where he was coming from. And while this was the enemy, and while they were trying to kill you, destroy you, damage you, as Ken said, that was their home, and we were there for whatever reasons we were there. And there was almost a grudging respect for their tenacity.
Thank you.
Hello. My question is, was your experience hard to speak about when you came back, and did you create friendships you still have? Was it really a brotherhood?
The first part was yes. It was very hard to talk about when I first got back, anyhow. As a matter of fact, it was many, many years before I really talked about it with anybody. That includes my wife. That includes my children, and even this day, my grandchildren. It's always been easier for me to talk about some of the things that went on. If I'm with Hank at lunch or something, and we're talking, and we get talking about some of the things that happened to us, or just they're generally funny things. It's easier for me to express myself in a group of veterans than people, and that's just because it's just easier to understand. So if that's a brotherhood, then yes, to your question, I think that's still true today. This is my second time here, and the first time I came, it took me several weeks to kind of calm down after talking to Mr. Shale's students in the classroom. It had nothing to do with you guys. You guys are great, but just like, whew, some of the stuff I hadn't thought about in a long time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
I made it a point coming home to stay in touch with, a bunch of guys that I was with in the Army, either in Vietnam or in training. And even now, to this day, we've been home over 50 years. We still keep in touch, visit each other regularly. We don't tell a lot of war stories. And we talk mostly about what's going on in our lives, our families' lives, that kind of thing. It's not like let's get together over a few beers, and reminisce about the day we blew an ambush on somebody. It's not that at all. But as Ken said, there really is a comfort level there that you don't have with a lot of other people.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would say that I don't necessarily keep in as much contact as some others have. But when one of the people I serve with reaches out, or I reach out, and it literally could be like, I haven't heard from you in 12 years, and they're asking me for something, I'll drop everything and help them, whatever it takes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so my name is Trisha, and I've been part of Mr. Shale's class for now, this will be my second year. I was in his AP US History class, and now I'm in his AP Government. And so we watched Mr. Carson's, we saw him in the documentary. This is my second time. And what Mr. Shale mentioned was the way that you looked physically older as time went on. So my question is for all three of you. Mentally, as you spent your time in such a traumatic and stressful situation, did you feel that you grew as a person mentally with your interests and the way that you thought about things?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I was 20-something, that picture you saw. And I sit here today, as I said, a father of 3, a grandfather of 6, and have had all the ups and downs, going through life that you can imagine, good jobs, bad jobs, etc. And now I'm retired and enjoy that very much. But yeah, you don't stop. I mean, those pictures are extraordinary. I'm sure if Hank had any of his, first of all, it was so hot that we all lost tons of weight. I weighed 152 pounds in that picture over there, or something like that. Now I weigh 210, so and that's one change. But it was good. And my mother, I remember when I got home, my mother said, "Oh my God, you're so thin, you're gonna waste away." And I said, "No. In a 100-degree climate every day, you need to weigh 152 if you're going to survive." So your body just knows that and reacts to it. But in terms of growing, maturing, ups and downs and whatnot, I feel, if anything, it just helped me because it gave me a lot of discipline in the service in general.
Thank you.
When I got home, the day I got home, and after hugging and kissing my parents and all of that, I went upstairs and I took perhaps the longest bath in American history. And I reclined in the tub with a cigarette and a glass of scotch. And I reflected on everything that had gone before and what I wanted to do in the future. And it took me a little bit of time, in a sense, to get back on track. But then I went to college and graduate school and a whole lot of other things. But I look back on that experience, actually more the training than the fighting, as giving me motivation and the ability to hang in there when things get really tough.
And I agree with that as well. I will say that experiencing war is obviously it's a life-changing event, but it completely changes your worldview of how things are supposed to operate. and kind of what you've been taught growing up from your parents and everything else, you know, there is a point where at the end of the day, force is the only thing that potentially can resolve something. And you see that in nature. I'm not saying, you know, you see that always in nature. It's just fact of life there. But trying to, you know, kind of, I mean, you do grow mentally with all that, but you have to figure out how to process some of the things that you've experienced. And there's a lot of different ways. Some are healthy and some are not. You know, if you ever go through a struggle, you know, one of the good things you can do is become a voracious reader. You know, for example, like there's a book called Achilles in Vietnam, which kind of takes some Vietnam experiences and overlays those with some Greek literature. Very, very interesting there. And you know, probably my one book recommendation to anyone would be Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning. And I won't spoil it for you, but it's a survivor of the Holocaust and kind of describes why some people could make it out of a situation and why some couldn't, based on kind of like your mental state, right? So it's always a journey to try to kind of figure out and process the things that you've gone through and how you can utilize those in a positive way to move forward in life.
Thank you.
Amanda?
Hi, so I was just wondering, what was the worst food you had to eat while you were overseas? I imagine that there was not an abundance of great food to eat.
I like this. A little bit lighter to lift us up a little bit.
Well, there was no McDonald's around or anything like that. Well, I drank, start with that, I drank water out of like a little hoof print of a water buffalo that had been in the mud. And I don't know, we drank, I don't remember, like, you know, picking anything from the trees or doing anything like that. So we always had rations, you know, combat rations of some kind that, you know, I carried around with me in my backpack wherever I was. So I loved canned peaches. They were like gold if you got them. We used to trade this stuff back and forth all the time. I don't know, any of you guys like Franco-American? Do they still make that stuff? I don't even know. But it was the spaghetti at the time, and that was a big deal, you know. So all this stuff came in cans, and you would just open it with your rats. But that were about my two things. The only kind of off thing was the water that we used out of the footprints because we were all pretty thirsty.
Thank you.
There was an occasion when we defended a tiny, tiny village from attack, you know, by Viet Cong. And in return, some of the villagers wanted to feed us, give us stuff to eat. So we said, sure, you know, we'll do that. Thank you very much. You know, we wanted to be gracious. And among, you know, the dishes, several different kinds of vegetables and things, was some meat being stirred in a pot, you know, seared and simmered in a pot. And I reached in with, you know, with a fork and took a bite of it. And I'm surprised I'm not still chewing it to this day, because it was the toughest thing that I had ever, you know, had in my mouth. And the taste was very odd. So I said to one of the guys, what is this? And one of the women from the village, you know, mentioned a word in Vietnamese, you know, that this is whatever it was. And I turned to someone, I said, does anybody know what that is? And they said, yeah, it's dog. So that was the meal of a lifetime.
I did not have that experience. No, I was lucky enough that there was always, you know, kind of just something there. And if you know, those of you that know kind of what I eat around here, I'm not very picky. But back to the rations thing, is an annoying thing that would happen is, they'd have the MREs and the rations kind of setting out, but inevitably there'd be this one person that gets there before everybody else, opens all the rations and takes all the good stuff, and then leaves the rest of it for you. So those were, I won't tell you what we called them, but those were not nice people.
Thank you.
This is Mr. McNutt, one of our faculty members.
Could you remind me who it was that we were talking about that came to speak last time?
I believe you saw Mr. Carson in my class, yeah.
Right, I believe it was Mr. Carson. So that was an incredible experience for me, and I appreciate you coming in. It's going to make me start crying thinking about that's how emotional it was to hear you speak. It really was.
Thank you.
You may or may not recall at the end of your presentation, I asked you a question, and I said, was it cathartic for you to talk about your experience over time? And do you remember what your answer was?
I hope I said yes at one point.
You did not. You
No.
said, you'll have to ask me tomorrow because I've never spoken about it.
Oh, well, you were right. Well, I said before, it's my first time.
Right.
you know.
So for you guys don't aware, the war was back in the late 60s, right? So for 40 plus years, he had never spoken. And the first time he ever spoke about it was in Mr. Shale's class. It was incredible to get to be a part of. So now I'm back to ask the question. Now that you have spoke about it, I'm curious now a few years later, how that has been, like, has it been cathartic to speak about? Do you speak about it more? Not that you're running around, but.
Well, thank you for the question. This is the first time I've had a group like this. I've had some smaller discussions, and I guess it does help me a little. I was thinking, sitting here, I'm not terribly interested in how much it helps me or doesn't help me at the moment. But what I really hope, and what I'd really like to ask you guys now, I know you're sitting here with all your teachers and everything around you, is this useful to you? Do you get a better feel for some of the stuff that you just reading in your books or on the internet as we share some of this with you? You can just yes or no shout out. You don't have to stand up or anything. How about, yeah? So we got mostly yes? Yeah, well, that's great. That makes me feel better when I get that response.
I'll need to sit down before I start crying.
Thank you.
I don't want to run out of time, but we can kind of, and I know some of this, Mr. McNutt's question and some of the questions we got, as your time in country and even your time in the service did wind down, I guess initially just the emotions of coming home. Mr. Luce, you mentioned, hugging and kissing your family. And then as you left the service and you kind of look back on it and process it, I guess, what was the initial experience coming home? We see in movies people coming home and seeing their loved ones for the first time. And then as you had time to kind of think about it, and as you do look back on it, I don't know, what kind of comes to mind when you look back on your service, in the years since?
I remember I was telling Ken just before we started. I came home. I was home, I don't know, a couple of weeks, and I was taking a playwriting class at the old Uppsala College down in East Orange, and obviously the play that I ended up writing, a little 2-act play, was about guys on their way to Vietnam, and those hours where we sat at Fort Dix McGuire Air Force Base, getting ready to get on a plane. We're there for a day or two before, stayed overnight, and get on a plane and go. So I was home a couple of weeks, and I came across a girl that I had dated in high school fleetingly, but knew, with among friends, that kind of thing. Came across her, and she said, "Well, I haven't seen you for a while." And I said, "Well, I've been busy. I've been, I was in the Army, and I was in Vietnam." And she looked at me. She went, "Are you a baby killer?" Because that's what a lot of guys are getting accused of. And I thought, how remote, how far away is where this young woman thinks things are today, and where just a couple of years ago when we were going to the movies and going out for pizza afterwards. What a gap between those two ways of looking at life and ways of looking at the world.
As far as getting out and all that, the process of getting out.
Yeah, I guess when you initially came home, you're seeing mom and dad or whomever, and then, you know, kind of transitioning into civilian.
As I found out I was going to get a full second deployment, and I had been with my, at the time, I guess, fiance for a long time. We made the decision to get married right before the deployment. My experiences from the first deployment, I wanted to hedge my bets that she would be taken care of should anything occur. So we got married, and then I left. So we got married and didn't see her for 18 months. So coming back was, it was happy, it was emotional. You know, I got to see my parents and everything else. But then the reintegration and the decompression that has to occur from the mentality needed to survive in a wartime scenario, trying to dial that down in order to be functional in a civilian society takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And again, it depends on what your experiences were in the military. You know, some people have more interaction on the front lines than others, but everybody goes through this process where they do have to adjust. And it's a difficult process, and sometimes it can be a lifelong process to go through. But definitely joy coming back and seeing your family members, and also sorrow if you have members from your unit that don't get to experience that.
With Mr. Carson and Mr. Luce, it's been more years. Mr. Caven's not, although you've been out for a while. I guess a very kind of brief question. How often do you think about it, your time in the service, in war?
I think that there are a lot of reminders that come up kind of spontaneously. It's not as if I personally sit around and brood about it and try and make sense of it, or think about it in my lonely moments. But there are reminders that happen frequently. Firecrackers on the 4th of July, for example, will remind me of gunshots. So there are things that'll happen, or any kind of an explosion will do that. But I don't think that I carry a sullenness or a burden or not being particularly morose about thinking about that. But there are things that happen spontaneously.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes you never know. You might, it could be a firecracker. Sometimes you see something or somebody says something that just takes you back and makes you think of certain things. But I certainly don't, dwell on it and just think, God almighty, sit in a room by myself for 4 days and think how lucky I was to get home. You go on with your life. You live the best you can, and these things pop up and you deal with them, and then you move on.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the brain, but the amygdala is a very powerful agent in there. It's kind of like your lizard brain, which kind of stores certain emotions towards survival, right? So you're going about your day and something, it's called a triggering event, or something that reminds you of something that occurred when you were in wartime. Sometimes you can feel like you kind of are back in there. So does it happen every day? Maybe, maybe not, but these things do happen. But, one of the things you have to remember too is, you're not doing anyone any services by kind of wallowing in either self-pity or survival guilt, whatever it happens to be. And oftentimes the best way you can honor the people that you serve with is to try to lead, you know, a good life that is worthwhile, that impacts positively others. And honestly, that's one of the reasons I love getting into education, you know, because I was still able to help people.
It's hard to take so much information and really narrow it down, but if you could, you know, as we kind of wrap up here, for the students here, what would you say, if anything, you would like as a takeaway that you could impart upon these kids today based upon your time serving your country, your time in war, you know, perhaps something that maybe people who haven't experienced don't really understand, that you think would be beneficial for us to, as kind of a takeaway as we, you know, leave school today?
So, after you came back, did you experience, for any of your cases, anyone, obviously there are people that oppose going to war in general, but did you have any experiences with people who were ignorant or disrespectful, and how did you combat that?
Well, I did meet some people. I came through Travis Air Force Base in California, in San Francisco, when I was being discharged. And, you know, as soon as I got, like, onto the street, I'm like, whoa, you know, like, you heard Hank tell the story about his friend. And, you know, I would clearly say they were disrespectful, but I tried to be respectful of their opinion. I tried to either ignore them, which is generally what I did, or you know, if somebody asked me a legitimate question, answer it as truthfully as I could, because what they were saying to me and what was really going on were really polar opposites. Some people accepted that, most of them did not.
Thank you.
I think I tried to avoid confrontations or some kind of justification. You know, when people would say things, I didn't believe it was my job to explain and justify the entire war. You know, I could only explain what my response to it was, how parts of that experience were painful, how parts of that experience were joyous, and much like going through life itself, you know, the good days and the bad days, and how you adapt and reflect upon them is really important, and what you learn from that and how it alters your life, hopefully for the better, is what's most important.
I was kind of fortunate enough to, you know, serve much later, when there was a little bit more push towards, you know, recognizing, you know, service and veterans. Also, when I was getting out of the military, it was just becoming, like mental health was just starting to come out as something to be considered and all that. What I was most surprised with is people who I considered friends from high school were the rudest people to me. And yeah, it was nothing to cut them out of my life, you know. I mean, I'd already served with people that were vastly superior to them anyway. So no big deal.
Thank you.
I do want to say, and Mr. McNutt kind of touched on this. You know, I've worked with Mr. Cavins for 7-8 years now, and I think, you know, we're good work buddies. We chat about non-work stuff, but we don't hang out after work. I was aware of his service, certainly not any details about it. It wasn't the kind of thing I was going to bring up as we're trying to fix the copy or something. And like I mentioned, I grew up with, to me, this was my Uncle Keeney and my Uncle Henry. You know, you probably have those people in your family, you call, like if I was telling my sisters, I saw my one sister last week and I said, oh, Uncle Keeney and Uncle Henry are coming to speak to my students next week. Because that's how involved they were in my life. as a kid, family parties and stuff like that. And as I got older, I learned that they had served, and I speak to my parents, and they both know my parents since high school. They went to Del Barton down in Morristown. My dad graduated with these two gentlemen. And even when I mentioned to my dad would say, well, my dad was in Dover Air Force Base. He was stateside the whole time. And if I asked him anything over the years, he'd say, I really don't know. He's like, just like they said, when we meet, we shoot the bull and we joke and we laugh, and they came to my graduation parties, but no one wants to sit around and talk about this stuff. And it wasn't until Mr. Carson came, that Mr. Minut referenced, and Mr. Luce has come since then, that they've spoken about this. And I really do think it's important that we recognize this, we're appreciative of this. This is not something that everybody perhaps wants to do, or maybe it isn't always comfortable for them. And I think it's a real privilege for us to have this opportunity to speak to people who can really give this true firsthand experience. And we won't be in school next week for Veterans Day, but you see a veteran, doesn't take much, just say thanks for your service. If you know someone, there's different ways you can say thank you. So, in closing, I think we would all just like to say thank you very much. Thank you.